All right, welcome everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator here with the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And I'd like to welcome you to the Cooperating Technical Partners Information Exchange. There's a quarterly webinar series put on by the CTP subcommittee, and today we're going to be telling you all about the FEMA TMAC. But before we get into that, as usual, if you've joined us before, I have a few admin announcements to get through, just to kind of orient everybody and let you know what to expect today. Number one, just so everyone knows, we've got a big audience today, so all lines are going to be muted. We're not going to be able to unmute you for conversation purposes, but we do want your participation today. So if you have questions, if you have comments about anything you see, go ahead and find the Q&A feature here within the Zoom interface and use that to send in your questions and comments. And we have a dedicated Q&A period at the end. So if you ask something early on that's not addressed, try to be patient and we'll take as many as we can as time allows. The other thing about participation in today's event is we're going to be asking you to complete several polls. So we'll prompt you at that time. There will be links sent out in the chat panel, and you can access the polls there. Each poll is several questions in duration, so we'll kind of go over that more in depth when the time comes, but I just wanted to prime you all to let you know there are polls coming later on. Next thing, continuing ed, certificates of attendance, things like that. This event is eligible for continuing education. If you're a CFM and you participate in the entire event, you will be getting credit for it. It's going to take us a week or so, potentially even up to 2 weeks to add those credits to your record. So please be patient with us there, but we'll certainly do that for you. And then as far as the certificate of attendance goes, we'll be sending those out to eligible attendees as well. That's going to take us a week or so, and we'll email that to you directly as a PDF. So in about a week, maybe a week and a half, we'll get you that certificate of attendance, link to the recording of this event, and any other promised follow-up materials from today as well. So just wanted to let you know when to expect those types of things. A couple of additional logistics here. Again, this is a quarterly webinar produced by ASFPM, and we are always kind of thinking about the next one, looking for topics and things of that nature. So if you have an idea you think might be a good fit for this webinar series, you can email Alan Luloff in our Flood Science Center. His email's up there on the screen, so go ahead and shoot him an email if you have any ideas. And just a last note, again, we've got 90 minutes set aside for this event, so we're going to try to stay as on time as possible, and we'll take some questions at the end. But with that, I do want to introduce Alan to tell us a little bit more about the CTP subcommittee and a little bit more about today's topic and speakers. Alan, take it away.
Good day. And my name is Alan Luloff. I'm with the ASFPM Flood Science Center. And this is, like Kevin said, a quarterly webinar we put in. This is funded by FEMA and supported by FEMA. And this is in support of the FEMA Cooperating Technical Partners Program. Our board of directors passed a resolution about 5 or 6 years ago supporting the program, and we actually created a subcommittee of our Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee to focus on this issue. And the two co-chairs of that subcommittee are Joanna Rolfe and Dave Gannett. I appreciate all their support. Brooke Seymour is also on the call today, was a past co-chair and is now co-chair of the Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee. You can see the primary goals of this subcommittee, and one of the major things we do is put on these quarterly webinars, and we really are pleased that this is as well attended as it is. So today we've kind of covered the administrative items by Kevin, and I'm doing the introductions now. Here you can see the agenda for today and the speakers that will be presenting, and they're going to give a short introduction of themselves as they get to their topic. One thing I would like to highlight is that one of our kind of past leaders of our organization, Les Bond, who passed away in 2013, highlighted one of the issues they'll be presenting on their recommendations, and that is the confidence interval and their associated with the FEMA flood studies. And going from a higher confidence interval from the present use of 50%. So I just want to give an acknowledgement to Les Bond. He's pushed this issue for a long time, and nice to see that TMAC has included a recommendation associated with that. So with that, we'll get into the content of the webinar today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Hey, Vince, this is Kevin. Your display is flipped, so we're seeing.
Oh, I got to flip it again? Okay,
Yeah.
hold on. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, no problem.
Display settings, just a second. Okay, how's that?
Well, it's still showing the same view. You might have to stop sharing and then
Okay,
reshare.
hold on a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Give me
Go
1
ahead.
second.
Yeah, no problem. Take a minute.
Let me
Yeah, take a minute and just kind of get it set up how you need it. In the meantime, I wanted to just kind of reiterate to the audience here, but we're using the Q&A for questions and comments, and then we also have the chat feature, which is a separate area of Zoom here, live for this particular webinar. We typically don't have that available, but that's where we're going to be doing our polls, is in the chat area, and then questions and comments in the Q&A. So just kind of take a look at those menu options if you're not familiar there. But otherwise, Vince, that looks good. If it works for you.
Is that good now?
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm sorry for that little hiccup there. Good afternoon and welcome to this presentation on the activities of the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, or TMAC. I am Vince DiCamillo with Stantec and the current chair of TMAC. The purpose of this TMAC presentation is to provide you with a broad understanding of the purpose and functions of TMAC, highlight some past and present accomplishments, and let you know what topics we are currently assessing in 2024. There will be 3 segments to this presentation. The first covers the origins and composition of TMAC and provides an overview of some of the past accomplishments. I will lead this part of the discussion. The second will cover the 2023 TMAC recommendations pertaining to the redefinition of the special flood hazard area, implementing 2D modeling, and communicating complex flood risk data. This will be conducted by Doug Bellamo. And the final segment will be a look at what TMAC is assessing this year. That's a look forward, but the forward is now. That part of the presentation will be conducted by Brooke Seymour and Jamie Renke. As we start each segment, the presenters will elaborate on their backgrounds. We will pause for questions after segment 2, and in segment 3, we'll be asking some poll questions, which was referenced earlier. I will now start segment 1. So this segment provides the origins, context, roles, past reports, and recommendations of TMAC. This presentation is not on behalf of FEMA, but the information I am providing is publicly available if you go on FEMA.gov and search under TMAC. As I mentioned at the beginning, I am Vince DiCamillo, the current chair of TMAC, and we'll be presenting this segment. A little bit about my background. I am the mapping professionals representative to TMAC, and I have been working in the FEMA mapping program as a consultant for over 48 years and do my best to bring the experiences I've gained across my career to TMAC to support our assessments, deliberations, and recommendations. The TMAC is an advisory committee established by Congress under the Biggert-Waters NFIP Reform Act of 2012. The purpose of TMAC is to provide FEMA with advice and recommendations to improve the preparation of firms created under the NFIP and on future risks from climate change, rising sea levels, and development. The principles and functions of TMAC are contained within the TMAC Charter. This document is available on the FEMA.gov website. Simply search on TMAC Charter. The Charter, which is updated every 2 years, includes the objectives and scope of activities, descriptions of duties, composition of membership, and frequency of meetings. TMAC is responsible for performing an assessment and evaluation of issues or topics related to mapping activities to revise or update firms and make recommendations where deemed appropriate by the TMAC members. The results of TMAC's assessments, evaluations, and recommendations are delivered to the FEMA administrator in an annual report. TMAC's recommendations are focused on ensuring that firms reflect the best available science and are based on appropriate methodologies for considering the impacts of future development on flood risk. Little disclaimer here, it is important to note that TMAC's duties and actions are solely advisory, and that FEMA has no obligation to adopt the recommendations of TMAC. The TMAC charter specifies the composition of TMAC membership. Membership includes a broad group of representatives from federal, state, local, and private sector organizations who have roles in floodplain mapping and flood risk assessment, including expertise in engineering, surveying, GIS and mapping, and floodplain management. Just a little brief statement here about the membership selection process. To identify and select members of TMAC, FEMA posts TMAC vacancies through the Federal Register. Candidates are reviewed to determine if they have the appropriate background and experience needed to support the TMAC. The TMAC terms are typically 3 years, but FEMA may extend terms of membership up to 6 years. And this role is strictly voluntary. The TMAC also includes a designated federal officer or DFO who provides or who approves and schedules meetings, approves meeting agendas, attends all TMAC meetings, facilitates public comment sessions, and chairs meetings in the absence of the TMAC chairman. According to the charter, TMAC must have a minimum of 2 meetings per year. However, TMAC typically holds 10 to 12 meetings per year. About half of these meetings are administrative working meetings, and the other meetings are open to the public, and each of these meetings allows for a specific public comment period. TMAC public meetings are officially advertised in the Federal Register and communicated through other channels. A little bit about the typical sequence of events. So a typical TMAC annual sequence of events is something like this. There's an annual kickoff in the spring of each year where FEMA provides the TMAC with suggested areas where they seek assistance from TMAC. TMAC then convenes a series of meetings and working sessions, administrative and public, to assess the topics, deliberate, engage subject matter experts and stakeholders, and ultimately develop recommendations for FEMA where deemed appropriate. Final recommendations are voted upon by the TMAC membership and included in an annual report developed by TMAC that includes findings and recommendations. The report is typically delivered to the FEMA administrator 1 year from the start of the annual process. Since standing up in 2015, TMAC has issued 16 reports, including 9 annual reports, 4 interim and summary reports, and 3 special reports. Collectively, TMAC has made 151 recommendations to FEMA. Please note, as I may have mentioned earlier, all previous reports are available on the FEMA.gov website. Simply search on TMAC and then go to reports and recommendations. They're all there and available for viewing and downloading. Past recommendations from TMAC have covered a wide range of themes. I won't read all these, but please note that about 70% of the recommendations were regarding the 3 recurring themes that I highlighted: developing standards and processes, flood risk management, and future flood conditions. The 151 recommendations of TMAC have covered a wide range of topics, with some of the more notable topics including maintenance of flood risk data and data accuracy, 2D modeling and probabilistic flood risk analysis, the 1% annual chance flood standard, consideration of future conditions and climate change, and improving equity in delivery of flood risk data and increasing flood resilience in disadvantaged communities. Please keep in mind that many of these recommendations require a series of actions to implement, including potential regulatory changes. These actions take time and effort. Approximately 75% of the TMAC recommendations are implemented or initiated. And without going into specifics, we can say that TMAC recommendations have played an important role in FEMA's Future of Flood Risk Data, or FFRD, initiative, with over 30 TMAC recommendations being addressed through FFRD. The FEMA FFRD initiative provides a more comprehensive picture of the country's flood hazards and risks by leveraging new technologies to include more efficient, accurate, and consistent flood risk information across the nation. I know I went kind of fast. That's probably the boring part. This concludes the first of the 3 segments. We're going to move on to segment 2, what's new, an overview of the 2023 TMAC recommendations presented by Doug Bellamo. And then, as we indicated earlier, following Doug's presentation, we will open up for some questions before conducting the 3rd segment, which will discuss TMAC's current assessment. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to Doug. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince. Let me share my screen here. You guys see that okay?
Yes, looks good.
Awesome. So thanks again, Vince. Just a quick introduction of myself. I'm Doug Bellamo. I'm a civil engineer by education. I currently work for AECOM in our water resources business line. I've got about 30 years experience, both on the federal side and also now on the private sector side in flood risk management. And I was the chair in 2023 when the 2023 report came out. So there were 4 asks of FEMA when we started our 2023 process. So typically, FEMA will send a memo over to the TMAC at the beginning of the year and ask, can you look into these things? Also, typically, TMAC takes those thoughts into consideration and usually follows them, although they're not necessarily bound to follow them. And these were the 4 that came out during the beginning of calendar year 2023 in the spring. And so it was taking a look at modifying the definition of special flood hazard area, or looking at how the SFHA is currently calculated without necessarily redefining it, changing procedures for loam RFs and letters of map change based on fill, looking at the administrative and technical challenges of implementing 2-dimensional H&H modeling for regulatory purposes, and then explore acceptance of some of the ways FEMA may present some of the more complex data developed through probabilistic methods. So one of the first steps the TMAC took in developing the 2023 report was to identify some objectives toward looking at those 4 specific topic areas. And these are the 6 here. I won't read them in detail to you, but clearly reducing losses is a focus. Flood losses is a focus of the Technical Mapping Advisory Council. Improving transparency around climate change and land use changes on flood risk, usability of products and communication of flood hazard data and flood hazard and risk information, increasing the technical credibility of the products, and then, of course, transition in management over time. So these are the 12 recommendations that were outlined in the report. I've drawn some red boxes here just to show how they group together and overlay with the objectives. So at the top, you see the six objectives. You see the 4 topic areas down there on the left, and then you see the recommendations. AR stands for Annual Report Recommendation 45, all the way through Annual Report Recommendation 56, and I'll dive into these. But as you can see, any one objective hits multiple, any one recommendation hits multiple objectives, and many of the objectives are hit by many of the recommendations. And so there's a table like this in the front end executive summary of the report. It's a good way to take a look at sort of why the recommendations were developed and what objectives they're operating up against. So that said, I'm going to talk about these objectives kind of as a bundle. So it'll be 4 objectives around topic 1, and then 1 of the objectives around topics 3 and 4. And it's really about the definition of the special flood hazard area, some of the administrative and technical challenges, and then the probabilistic views of data. So the first recommendation, Annual Report Recommendation 45, really says split the current special flood hazard area into 2 pieces. One piece for meeting the requirements of mandatory purchase, and another piece for meeting floodplain management requirements. And so the idea there is under the status quo in that little yellow bubble there, Al mentioned this at the beginning. The current way the special flood hazard area is identified, it really underestimates the 1% annual chance flood half the time. And so the TMAC, looking, again, toward its objectives, said if you want to reduce the number and magnitude of uninsured losses compared to today, you might want to use a higher confidence value when delineating the special flood hazard area. So you see up there, new SFHA and a little subscript 95%. That means identify the special flood hazard area for the purposes of mandatory purchase at the 95% confidence level. Use a higher confidence level. And then for the flood prone area, it goes into this FPA, flood prone area, 95%, again, confidence level, plus future conditions. And this, of course, would help reduce future losses compared, again, to this status quo of a mean value. So this is just a quick slide. I think it's interesting. Most people who interact with technical information, even though they may not be technical, they look at things like this, an elevator, it's, max load is 2,000 pounds or 12 people. They feel pretty confident if they have 12 people on or less than 2,000 pounds, they're going to be okay. The elevator will operate and not crash through the bottom floor. Similar to maybe hitching a camper to the back of your car. If it says it can pull 5,000 pounds, they feel comfortable that if they put 5,000 pounds on the car, it's not going to fail and break off or cause an accident of some kind. But the SFHA is different. Using the mean value, most people, I think, interpret the maps as, well, if I build outside that floodplain, I can be assured that a 100-year flood's not going to get me, when in fact, as I mentioned before, it's going to underestimate that flooding condition half the time. And so this is in disconnect with how I think a lot of other things are discussed in terms of technical issues, engineering issues. And so the TMAC's thought was bring it more, more closely align it with things that people think of when they look at technical information. And so AR46 here is essentially associated with this SFHA 95%. The TMAC did do some preliminary analysis to see what the difference might be between a mean or 50% confidence level 100-year flood elevation and this 95% level. There were some 256 sites identified. There's an appendix in the report that describes the process to come up with this estimate, but the difference between those two, the mean and the 95% confidence level, was on the order of 0.2 feet to 6 feet. So that's quite a wide range. So at one location or several locations, you can see differences of 6 feet between these two numbers, but at other locations, it's less than a quarter of a foot. And 90% of the time, that difference was less than 3.3 feet. So this recommendation 46 is develop this special flood hazard area for mandatory purchase at the 95% confidence limit. The next AR47 is develop a flood prone area, which is reflective of not just the increased confidence, the current condition, 95% confidence value for the 100-year flood or 1% annual chance flood, but estimate future conditions on top of that. So in looking at this figure, you see the 95% confidence limit. That would be the SFHA 95. And because encroachments are allowed in the floodplain, in very rare situations in the floodway, you would add this allowable surcharge or rise because it's expected from a hydraulic perspective. And then you would add other planned or possible increases. And these could include things like increased runoff from future land use plans. It could include future projects that might bring more discharge to a river source. It could include also things like sea level rise in coastal communities. And so the idea here is if you want to avoid as much future loss as possible, use this higher confidence limit, add the surcharge associated with the establishment of the floodway and the minimum rules for floodplain management, and then add the other planned and possible increases associated with what we know about the climate or future land use plans. Two other recommendations, 48 and 52. The TMAC said, if you're going to develop the 100-year around the 95% confidence limit, identify the 95% confidence limit for the 500-year. And then in AR 52, be clear about when changes to the new special flood hazard area and flood prone area are warranted. So that would say essentially standardize the processes for developing these new areas, and then be clear about how you're changing them over time. Okay, topic area 2. So we've got this topic that FEMA outlined, changing procedures for LOMAR-Fs. There were 2 recommendations associated with that. The first, AR 49, was to put all the requirements associated with fill into the floodplain management section of the regulations. Right now, there are some fill requirements that are actually outlined in the mapping section of the Code of Federal Regulations. And so the idea was, if you have certain standards associated with fill placement or grading, put those in the floodplain management rules so that everyone knows what the rules are prior to doing fill, as opposed to having to find out about them later if they're going through a map change process. So this was aimed at consolidating and bringing some clarity around the current fill requirements. And then AR 50 was about notification. And the TMAC discussed this at length. This is a pretty big recommendation. This quad diagram over here on the right essentially says, if you're proposing to do any kind of development in a floodplain or modification to land in a floodplain, the first thing you'll need to do is an assessment of the possible negative environmental consequences and the possible increases in flood hazard. And then when you suspect there may be some negative environmental consequences or some negative impacts on flood hazards, meaning that flood hazards could go up, you would notify impacted property owners or people living in those areas, and you'd also notify the proper environmental agencies. A flip side, of course, of that was if you do an assessment and there are no potential negative impacts to the environment or no potential increases in flood hazards, no notification would be required. And then, of course, in the 2 other diagonal components of this quad chart, it's a mix. Some where there's potential negative consequences environmentally, but no increases in flood hazards, and the other where there may be some increases in flood hazards and no potential negative impacts. So the last 2 topics are covered by recommendations 51 and then 53 through 56. So I'll touch on those. AR 51 and 53, this talks about essentially collaboratively establishing new standards, particularly when it comes to some of these newer methods for identifying flood hazards and developing the 2D modeling framework. And the other is associated with IT infrastructure. So a lot of the newer tools are more demanding computationally. There's a lot more data and information that needs to be stored and then accessed or retrieved. So it'll be important for FEMA to establish an IT infrastructure that really supports some of these newer technologies. 3 more recommendations on transition and implementation. ARs 54 through 56. AR 54 talks about telegraphing change and seeking input, again, collaboratively developing elements of the new program. AR 55, again, similar spirit, work with stakeholders to develop new model ordinances that address some of these recommendations, assuming, again, that FEMA decides to move on them. And then the last, AR 56, is about training. Develop, deploy, and facilitate training for some of this change, and any other future programmatic changes. So just to wrap up real briefly, and we will have an opportunity to discuss, or at least take some questions in the Q&A section of the webinar here. Really, the TMAC thought this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to put the nation on a better path toward building flood resilience in communities and states. Again, these are recommendations, as Finn's touched on. They're advisory in nature. FEMA has to decide if, when, or how to implement them. FEMA also, or the TMAC also recognizes that that change does take time, and these are pretty big recommendations. Several of them are pretty big recommendations that will definitely take time. Potentially rule change. Again, these are decisions FEMA would have to make. And then, if you want to learn more about what the TMAC deliberated on and how it came to some of these recommendations, I would encourage you to go to the website, download the report, and dive in. So with that, I think we've got, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes or so to answer some of the questions you may have on this. And then once that short session is over, I'll turn it over to Brooke and Jamie for their pieces.
Okay, thank you, Doug. A lot of good information there. So getting a couple questions about the 95% confidence limit. And so this one just came in, so I'm just going to read it, and hopefully it'll make sense to you. But Appendix F, 95% confidence limit, looked at just gauge analysis, Bulletin 17B, as part of the uncertainty. Is the intent to only look at hydrology as a source of uncertainty, or is a more comprehensive analysis planning using propagation of uncertainty from all sources, topographical, filed survey, Manning's N, choice of hydraulic or hydrologic model, choice of distribution, rainfall, etc. So kind of a, I don't know if you're able to glean what the specific question regarding the 95% confidence limit is there, but certainly people kind of asking for some additional information, or maybe like inside baseball on that.
Yeah, sure. I'm actually really glad someone read the appendix. Sometimes those don't get read, and so it's great to see somebody actually opened it up and read it. And absolutely, this was just uncertainty associated with the hydrology and the hydraulics. I would think that would be a good place for FEMA to start to quantify uncertainty, but all the other elements the person asked, all those also bring in additional uncertainty. And so maybe over time, the skill at estimating uncertainty values in these estimates goes up, and I would expect the methods for estimating the uncertainty to change with time. But at a minimum, we can clearly address the uncertainties associated with the flows. So I would say that would be a good place to start, and then tackling some of the more challenging parts of uncertainty later.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And then kind of sticking with the 95% confidence limit, someone had just clarified something. Just asking, was there discussion about potential unintended consequence of loss or reduction of freeboard? So was that kind of a discussion point?
Interesting. Yeah, so for levees, this did come up. One of the regulations, the federal regulations now stipulates that there has to be freeboard on top of levee systems above the current BFE. I'm assuming that may be what the questioner is asking about. And we did have discussions. We talked about, would a freeboard be necessary, and if it was necessary, would it still be on the order of 2 feet as a minimum, and 3 feet or 3 feet as a minimum, 2 feet in some places, which is what the current regulation says. And And the discussions basically concluded it would be logical for FEMA to relook at those regulations with respect to freeboard if they chose to implement this change. And so again, TMAC doesn't speak for FEMA. In fact, I don't even speak for TMAC. TMAC speaks for itself on its reports, but I would say it would make sense should FEMA decide to go down the road of defining the SFHA based on this 95% confidence limit, that they would have to look at any regulations that involve freeboard requirements, including those associated with levies.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much. So Joanna is asking, and we'll take, if you don't mind, Doug, I think we'll try to take maybe two or so more, and then we'll continue on and save the balance of questions until the end. But so Joanna is asking, what would the flood insurance requirement SFHA be based on? Smaller or larger than the floodplain management SFHA?
That's a good question, Joanna. The council really talked a lot about how these two different pieces of the floodplain would work together. And so the current thinking around the SFHA 95% is that it would be at smaller or equal to the FPA. So for example, I talked about that equation under the FPA 95 future conditions. If a community had no surcharge, for example, let's say they had delineated their floodways to 0.0 surcharge. I know some states have 0 surcharge. I know some local governments have 0 surcharge. The middle part of that equation that's in that graphic would essentially go to 0 because they're not allowing encroachments that cause any increases. If they then went and said, well, we're looking for other planned and possible increases due to land use changes, and maybe they're a rural community and they don't plan to change much, if at all. They're agricultural, they're going to stay agricultural, they're not estimating any growth in their community over the next 30 years. Maybe they do a little investigation and find out that there isn't any predicted changes to rainfall patterns in the future. That might also go to 0. And so if those two parts of the flood prone area go to 0, you in essence end up with a flood prone area that's equal to the SFHA 95 for mandatory purchase. But if one of those is non-zero, then the FPA will be bigger. So the short answer, I think, to your question is the FPA will always be bigger than the SFHA 95. At a minimum, it will be equal to, if that makes sense.
And Doug, I think Joanna was also getting at the mandatory purchase. Which one would that be based on? And so the mandatory flood insurance would be based on the SFHA.
Yeah, the SFHA 95, right.
Which wouldn't include the future conditions.
Would not include future conditions, correct.
But this is Alan Luloff, and I just wanted to highlight what Doug was talking about when it came to floodway surcharge, because while he highlighted that there are some states that have higher standards and have either 1/10 of a foot, or even Wisconsin is a 0, and Montana and Colorado 1/2 a foot. Many states have a 1 foot surcharge, and so it's very SFPM is very pleased to see that that is listed as a future condition that should be considered, because if you have a floodway that's developed on a 1 foot surcharge, you're really shrinking the natural floodway by 1/2, and so as that fringe gets developed, you're going to see increases in flood elevation. So the fact that they've included that as a future condition is very well received by ASFPM. We really appreciate that they've included that. ASFPM has several publications on their website showing the impact of floodway surcharge. And so if you want to delve into that some more, you can go to our website and search on floodway surcharge, and you see the reports that we developed over time that show the impacts of that. So I just wanted to highlight it. That is a very positive piece of this report.
All right, Joanna, based on the response, I would say that was an excellent question. So thanks for writing in, and thanks to our panel for addressing that. I promise we are going to move on, Doug. I just want to ask you two kind of tangentially related timing kind of questions, and then we'll move on from there. So number one is just a question. Sounds straightforward. I know it's not. When will these recommendations be enforced? So if you want to if you're able to just kind of comment generally on what that process or timeline, how that might play out. So when will it be enforced? And then Joy is asking, will there be a schedule released showing the order in which different community flood prone area determinations will be made?
Yeah, good questions. The truth is, I don't know when it would be enforced, and the reason is because these are just recommendations. FEMA would have to essentially agree to moving forward with the recommendation. They could agree to moving forward with it, but in a different way. In other words, they could say, well, we think conceptually it's the right thing, but we think 95% is not the right confidence limit. We would want to use a different one, either higher or lower, whatever that may be. But also, they would have to allocate resources to do this. They would have to establish, more detailed guidance. And so I think it would be safe to say this is not happening overnight. Assuming that they want to move forward with the recommendation, it would take, in my opinion, years, I think, to implement. And so it's not something that's going to just happen. And in concert with the other recommendations in the report, the TMAC is very clear not to move, suggesting that if they're going to move in this direction, training would be needed, outreach would be needed, publication of draft methods so the public could comment on those draft methods would be needed. And so there would be a very long road to implementing this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And I know there's no kind of clear answer, but it helps kind of, I think, calibrate expectations there. And then the other question was just, will there be any kind of a schedule recommendation for a schedule showing the order in which different community flood prone area determinations would be made?
Could be.
Sure.
If FEMA decided to implement this and they decided to issue a schedule, then you would see one. If they didn't, then you wouldn't see one.
Yeah.
But I think as an idea, it makes sense to identify if FEMA wanted to move forward with these recommendations, they develop all the methodologies in collaboration with the public and people. They start moving down the road, having some sort of schedule in terms of which areas would go first or second, or if they would want to complete it all at one time and then issue it all at one time. I think that would be very challenging to do, but I think a schedule of some sort would make sense. Again, because one of the recommendations was, to be transparent and telegraph these changes so that people have the ability to adjust before the implications hit.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me. So, okay.
Let me just add something else to that too.
Please, Vince.
Please do refer to the actual report, the TMAC report, because in there we make recommendations, but we also put in there, FEMA should consider XXX. So there's other information in there about what suggestions we made that FEMA should consider beyond just the recommendation itself. So there is some additional information there. So please do go look at the report and look at the greater detail.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Vince. Okay, so thanks, Doug, for fielding some of those questions. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and we'll try to move along. Brooke, I think we've left you sufficient time here, but next we'll have Brooke Seymour with Mile High Flood District. So, Brooke, whenever you're ready.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So We just heard from Vince about TMAC's background and from Doug about the 2023 recommendations, and we had some great discussion there. We will have time at the end to come back to Q&A and follow up with several of the questions that I know are still open. But right now, we want to look ahead to the topics TMAC is focusing on for 2024. I'm Brooke Seymour with the Mile High Flood District in Colorado, and presenting this section with me today is Jamie Reinke with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. Our part of today's webinar will be interactive with polls to gather feedback. Your input will help guide TMAC's recommendations on the 2024 topics, and we really appreciate your participation. So with that, we would like to launch our first poll, which includes 3 demographic questions to help us understand who is participating in today's session. As Kevin said at the beginning, we're actually using an external program for the poll, so please go to the chat where you will find the link to the poll. And while you're navigating to the poll, I want to be sure to introduce Christine Brittle with Uncommon Insights. She is leading the whole stakeholder feedback process for TMAC and is helping us with today's polls. So Christine, would you like me to stop sharing so you can share the poll?
Yes, I'm still waiting for responses to come in, but you
Okay,
can go
all right,
ahead
let me know when
stop
you
sharing. Hopefully everybody can see that link in the chat. So it's not in the Q&A, it's in the main chat. So we have 546 people in the seminar, and I've got about 200 poll responses so far. So let's give it just another moment and then we'll share the responses.
Okay, great. Yeah, these are 3 pretty simple questions just to give us a sense of who all is in the audience.
All right, we're up to a little bit over 300 responses now. So I'll go ahead and refresh the results. Please do keep responding. I'll note too, in addition to informing our conversation today, TMAC is going to be looking at these poll results to inform the work that it decides to do going ahead. But I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen just to give you a sense of who all is participating today. As of right now, we have 416 responses. And you can see that we have quite a range in terms of diversity of experience. So about a quarter of you have been working in the field for more than 20 years, but 15% of you are newer to the field, less than 5 years, with the remainder of respondents working between 5 to 10 years and 11 to 20 years. In terms of the professional roles of the participants in the webinar today, we also have a pretty big mix. So it looks like the majority of you, slightly over half of you, are consultants or engineers or some sort of other professional not affiliated with a government agency. But about a third of you work for a local government. And then we also have participants who represent state governments, regional agencies, federal governments, a few people also representing interest groups or some other category. And then finally, in terms of the size of the community that everyone represents, you can see we also have a really nice mix. So that is really exciting. Some of you not representing a specific community, but among you who are representing a community, looks like most people are representing a small community, but then we also have several others representing medium or large or very large communities. So thank you all so much for participating. And for this session, like the other session, you can put your questions in the Q&A. I will stop sharing the results of the first poll, but there will be another one coming up. So thank you everyone for your participation.
Okay, yeah, it looks like we have a really good broad representation audience today. So that is great. And hopefully it gave everybody a little practice in finding the poll link because we have 2 more polls coming up. Back in May, TMAC received a letter from FEMA requesting our consideration of 2 topics for the 2024 annual report. Oops, sorry. Got a little preview of the slides there. All right, so let's start with the first topic in the letter. It states to address recommendations from the National Academies and TMAC And to support the evolution towards a risk-informed NFIP, FEMA is developing probabilistic approaches to better quantify flood hazard and risk and the associated uncertainties in those estimates. And here's the actual part that is the request. We request the TMAC recommend an approach for reviewing and validating FEMA's technical methodology for developing comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data. Now, the technical methodology mentioned here is being developed as part of FEMA's Future of Flood Risk Data, or FFRD initiative. FFRD aims to improve the understanding of flood hazards and risks using new technologies for more accurate and consistent information nationwide. A key concept for this first topic is FEMA's evolution towards a risk-informed National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. So let's take a closer look at what that means. I know there's a lot of words on the slide, but I think this is really important, so I wanted to get it all written out. FEMA is moving towards a risk-informed NFIP, but it's important to understand how the NFIP works today. The NFIP is currently a hazard-based program based on a median 1% annual chance flood. In the current program, hazards represent the potential for harm for the 1% annual chance flood event, but do not reflect the full harm associated with all flood events. Hazards are computed based on a deterministic approach, so based on a single set of inputs related to the median 1% flood. On the other hand, a risk-informed NFIP would account for not only a single flood hazard, but all floods, and also other factors related to losses or consequences. These include exposure, so people, property, functions, or systems that are impacted by the flooding. Vulnerability, the extent of injury or damage related to flooding. And it also uses a probabilistic approach, which reflects exposure from multiple flood events and vulnerabilities. A risk-informed NFIP is not just about identifying risk. It also needs to integrate floodplain management and insurance as those parts of the program. It all needs to be based on a risk-informed approach. This slide graphic, developed by FEMA's FFRD team, contrasts the traditional binary in-out approach, which is what we currently have, with graduated analysis and structure-specific risk assessments that would support a risk-informed NFIP. Probabilistic approaches are used to analyze a wide range of flood scenarios in a watershed to generate graduated hazard maps and support the calculations for site-specific risk data. This is another FFRD graphic that contrasts binary regulatory firms to comprehensive flood hazard and risk products from probabilistic analysis, highlighting inclusion of pluvial hazards, so from heavy rainfall and not just the riverine and coastal flooding, a wider range of flood frequencies. Going beyond inundation and water surface elevations, this can include gridded depth, velocity, shear stress, duration, and probability. It also includes site-specific risk assessments and impact estimates, which all leads to better informed decisions and hopefully more losses avoided. So as a reminder, FEMA asked TMAC to think about how to review and validate FEMA's technical methodology as it implements the following changes to the NFIP. Moving from a hazard-based to risk-informed program, moving from deterministic to probabilistic approaches, and moving from binary to graduated hazard data combined with risk information. TMAC believes that validating FEMA's methodology is very important, and we appreciate that FEMA recognizes this and has asked TMAC for recommendations on this topic. The validation is important to ensure the methodology is fully transparent and scientifically and technically credible, to increase public trust in FEMA's flood hazard and risk information, to ensure flood risk products support a risk-informed decisions at the state, local, and individual levels, and ultimately to reduce the nation's flood risk. All right, now we're going to start our second poll, which has 6 questions on this first topic. Your answers will help TMAC make recommendations for FEMA, so we really appreciate your input. We're posting the link to the poll in the chat, and I'll pause now to give everyone time to answer these questions. Once we're done with this poll and go through the results, I'll transition it over to Jamie, who will cover topic 2 in that letter.
And we'll just note there were more questions on this survey, so we'll give people a little longer to complete it.
Yeah, there's 6 questions and they're, they make you think a little bit more. Just to let you know, Brooke, we have about 65 responses so far. So I think people are just starting to finish the study. So we'll probably need to give it a couple more minutes. Okay, sounds good.
I see someone said in the chat, the poll is not working. I would say just try to click the link again. I don't know why it wouldn't be working.
Is it possible they're clicking the link to the first poll?
No, I don't think so. It's probably just that a bunch of people hit it all at once. We're up to 190 responses now. So clearly a lot of people are able to respond. But again, we have over 500 attendees. So we'll just keep giving it a little bit of time for people to finish.
Sounds good.
We're warming everyone up because the third poll is even slightly longer than this one, but we're up to 336 now. So let's give it about 1 more minute. And then if you don't have a chance to finish before I start sharing the results, please do keep answering the questions because we will look at this feedback, and that's part of the feedback that the TMAC will be taking into its discussions on this topic.
Yeah, that's a great point that I'll reiterate. Even if you don't get your answers in time, please do provide your feedback.
Okay, well, we're up to 381 responses. So why don't you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and I will go ahead and start sharing the results we have thus far, but please keep answering as we said. Oh, so we're already at 400. Okay, great. So the first question had to do with what the primary focus should be of the validation. And the answer that got the largest number of responses is effectiveness towards achieving that risk-informed NFIP. Almost half of you all picked that category, followed by 30% who said usability of data for stakeholders, and about a quarter that said accuracy of the results. The next question, question 2, was which technical aspects of the probabilistic modeling are most important to review and validate, and people were able to select up to 2 options. You can see the category that got the most votes was hydrology, so a little bit over half of you all selected that, followed by data sources, which 47%, but also quite a few of you picked hydraulics, 42%. And then followed by the analytical framework and data delivery, not as much in that other category, but we will see if we have the ability, what those other thoughts were that you all had. The next question was how important a third-party review is as an important aspect of validating FEMA's methodology. Most of you said it was very important, so a little bit over 60% said very important, and then 30% almost said important, 8% said somewhat important, and then very few of you, less than 2%, said that's not at all important to have a third-party reviewer. The next question looked at the types of data that would be an appropriate means or way to validate FEMA's methodology. And you can see lots of interest in multiple of these ideas. So the one that was selected most often, almost 3/4 of you said comparing the results to historical flood events of various sizes. Also, quite a few people, 65%, said comparing results to local knowledge of flood problem areas. 63% comparing results of historical flood events across varied geographies, and then 60% said pilot projects. And then also there are 10 write-in answers, which again, TMAC will look at in terms of what other ways there might be to validate, and very few of you selected none of the above. The next question had to do with transparency and how important transparency is in FEMA's data sources, assumptions, and methodology. There was strong agreement here that that's extremely important. 77% said it's extremely important, 20% said it's important, and 3% said somewhat important. And then question 6 related to stakeholder groups and which stakeholder groups are most important to involve to ensure the credibility and acceptance of these probabilistic approaches. The groups here that got the most votes were floodplain managers. So almost everybody, 86% said floodplain managers. 3/4 also said engineering consultants. And then there's a bit of a drop off after that. The next highest would be the general public at 31%, and then insurance industry representatives, 21.5%, and scientists, a little bit less than 1/4. All right, I will stop sharing the results. Brooke, let me know if you want me to pull those up again at any point.
Great, thank you so much. I really, again, appreciate everybody's input. We've got one more poll that'll be coming up, and right now I'm going to transition it over to Jamie to talk about topic 2 from that letter.
Okay, can everyone hear me? And can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, Christine. I am Jamie Ranke with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. I am the CTP representative on TMAC, and I'm serving as vice chair this year. I've worked in the floodplain management area for almost 20 years and have been a part of the CTP program for over 8. I am presenting on task 2 of the 2024 FEMA memo, which states TMAC has collected significant stakeholder input to inform FEMA's intent to capture a more complete understanding of flood hazard and flood risk. This feedback has demonstrated there is significant variability in customers' capability to understand and use comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data. As FEMA begins to ramp up national coverage of comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data, we request the TMAC recommend an approach, including milestones, to ensure effective use of comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data in a way that communities can use to effectively manage flood risk. That is a mouthful. So we are going to break it down a little bit at a time. The first part we'll focus on is this feedback has demonstrated there is significant variability in customers' capability to understand and use comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data. As part of the 2023 memo, the TMAC representatives believe that feedback from different groups would be valuable to best determine the solutions that would meet the most user needs, and the results of these listening sessions tie directly into the 2024 task 2. Some highlights of the listening sessions include, and I don't think many of these are surprising to this group, complex data produces more information, which improves communication in some respects, but can also increase confusion for some users. There are concerns on file sizes, usability, accessibility, run times. The NFIP is not designed for this type of data. Training will be very important for those that will be using the data that aren't using it now. And respondents wanted digital tools. Other considerations, it's possible there was feedback collection that may contribute to this topic that occurred as part of previous TMAC reports, and those will be reviewed if they apply. So the second part of this, as FEMA begins to ramp up national coverage of comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data, we request the TMAC recommend an approach including milestones. to ensure effective use of comprehensive flood hazard and flood risk data in a way that communities can use to effectively manage flood risk. As Brooke discussed, the differences between binary current state floodplain data and the graduated future state of floodplain data are drastic, and how communities use this data will depend on many factors. We will need to ensure that we meet the needs of communities, both large and small, and begin to change the narrative from a floodplain being a line on a map, you're in or you're out, to the overall graduated risk and the conversations that floodplains are a natural feature and are there whether there's a line on a map or not. This will require transformational change to programs that have been established for decades. There will be additional data available for communities, depth grids, velocity data, pluvial and fluvial flood hazards that can all be used to make risk-informed decisions that we hope will lead to a more resilient and safe nation. So we are not as far in task 2. We are still collecting a lot of feedback to make some of our decisions. So we are going to ask you to answer the questions in poll number 3 so that we can use this feedback to help inform some of our decision making.
Jamie, just to let you know, this is a longer poll and I'm starting to see a few responses, but most people haven't had a chance to finish yet.
Okay, thank you. And we'll reiterate that if everyone isn't able to answer before we start sharing the results in today's meeting, do please finish the poll so that we can use the results in our analysis that we're doing.
And we're up to over 200 responses now. Both of the last polls, we got over 400 responses. So I expect another minute or 2 would be helpful. I do see the comment in the chat about adding an other to one of those options. So that is helpful. Thank you. So we'll look at that. And if you have a chance to, feel free to put in the Q&A what other things you think TMAC should be looking at. That would be very helpful as they're deliberating through this process. So we're up to 300 responses. I think let's give it another minute or so, and then I can start sharing the results. And thank you all for your patience. We really appreciate it. It's so helpful to get your real-time feedback. All right, Jamie, we're up to about 400 responses. So if you want to go ahead and stop sharing
Okay.
your screen, I can share the results. All right, thanks everyone. So the first question in this poll related to how well your community understands the difference between flood hazard data and flood risk data. So this is interesting. So only about 12.5% of you all feel like your community really understands this difference. I will say that that is consistent with what we started to hear in the listening sessions that we did last year. Most people feel like your community somewhat understands this difference. And then about a third of you said that your community doesn't understand the difference at all. So thank you for that feedback. That's really helpful. The next question has to do with what should be included in an approach to ensure that communities can use flood risk data to manage flood risk. And lots of interest in all of these different suggestions. The one that got the most votes was training. So 87% of people thought training was important. But 76% of you all said guidance and standards, almost 75% said best practices, and 70% said technical support. So really large majorities of you said all of those are important. And then some of you also suggested other options. So thank you. We will certainly be looking at those. The next question related to what would compel you to want to use this flood risk data. So about 10% of you say, 12% say you don't need to be compelled. It's something that you're inclined to use. But for most of you, it looks like there are things that you would want to see to make it more compelling to use the data. So the one that got the most votes so far here would be flood insurance premium reductions. About 60% of people said that. Being required to use it, about 50% said that. And then about 43% each additional mitigation funding or additional support or technical assistance. And again, there are a few other answers, so thank you. We will take a look at those as well. The next question has to do with how prepared your community is to implement and use this type of data from an employee training perspective related to employee knowledge. The biggest answer here is somewhat prepared. Looks like actually a pretty even distribution around that idea of somewhat prepared. So about 20% of communities said that they're either prepared or very, very prepared. 41% somewhat prepared, and then 16% of communities said they're not at all prepared. The next one had to do with how prepared the community is to implement or use this information from a community acceptance perspective. And it looks like a sort of similar distribution here. About 38% said somewhat prepared. And then looks like about 16% said either prepared or very prepared, and 24% said not at all prepared. The next question had to do with what is most important to help prepare communities for this transition. And here we asked you all to select up to 3 responses. So the one that was seen as most important, 82% of you selected it as an option, is outreach and education to let communities know about these plan changes, followed by training programs, 72%, and guidance documents, 62%. Then there's a bit of a drop off after that with case studies, 36%, and IT improvements or support, 14%, seen as not quite as important. Question 7 had to do with which user groups will be most impacted by these changes. And again, we asked you to select up to 3 options. Here, the group that got the most votes is the floodplain managers. So 87% of you identified that as one of the user groups that will be most impacted, followed by the general public, 63.2%, and engineering consultants at 51.3%. Again, then a bit of a drop off with insurance industry representatives, 33%, and emergency managers and planners, 29%. Question number 8 had to do with how concerned you are about the accessibility and usability of this type of data for disadvantaged communities. Here it looks like most people are either very concerned or concerned. So 27% of you said very concerned, and 42% said concerned. About 25% said somewhat concerned, and very few of you, actually only 6%, said you're not at all concerned. So thank you. That's very interesting feedback. And then the last question had to do with what do you think would best help disadvantaged communities to understand and use this data? And here you were able to select all of the options. Looks like the one that got the most interest, 74%, said establishing partnerships with local community organizations. And then right around 60% for each of the other options, implementing community-specific training programs, developing user-friendly digital tools and platforms, and providing financial incentives or grants to encourage disadvantaged communities. And I believe this is the question someone had suggested an other option would have been helpful. And I think that's good feedback. I don't know why we didn't include that. But again, if you have specific thoughts for what else would be helpful, please go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A. That is helpful. So Jamie, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for answering all of the questions. I know that one was really long. And that is the end of my piece. We are open for questions now.
Okay, excellent. So we do have a balance of time here for some Q&A, questions that have been coming in throughout the duration of the presentation. So I'm going to try to see how many we can get to. We'll for sure take a few. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but if we don't read your question aloud to the panel and get an answer that way, we'll try to follow up and get something in writing at the very least. So with that, Joseph had a question from earlier asking, how do the new elevations of the 95% confidence levels align with the FFRMS map elevation levels?
I guess anybody could answer. We were all on the council together, but I think the answer to that question is they may or may not align depending. So the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard elevations that have recently been developed by FEMA are adding 1, 2, and 3 feet to the current BFE. So there was a graphic in the TMAC report that said about 90% of the difference between the 95% confidence limit and the median, 90% of the time it was 3.3 feet or less. So you could probably assume, I would say not safely because every site is different, that most of the time the +3 would be inclusive of that 95%, but there could be some situations where that +3 is actually lower than the 95% confidence limits. And so I think the shorter answer is there's really no direct correlation. It's very site specific. So you would want to do some investigations in your local area to make sure you know what the direct alignment is between that 95% confidence limit and the FFRMS values.
Yeah, and Doug, I will add to that the intent of going to the 95th% confidence limit and looking at future conditions is really trying to achieve a similar goal of FFRMS. So the intent is not for them to be additive. It's kind of, freeboard is one way that we're looking at it. This would be another way to look at it. It would be a little bit more site specific. Yeah,
great point. Yeah, 1 foot added to the BFE could be the 500-year flood in some places, and it could be the 105-year flood in other places. So yes, great point.
Yeah, that is a good point. And kind of speaking of site specificity or maybe even just regional variations, Gregory was asking, will the recommendation for the 95% confidence limits be applicable to coastal A and V zones?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did have discussions around coastal estimates of uncertainty, and there are ways to quantify those uncertainties, particularly in the storm surge elevations, the kind of underlying surge elevations, but it gets more challenging when you put uncertainty on top of some of the wave conditions. And so the TMAC didn't go into great detail on how to calculate, say, a 95% confidence value on a base flood elevation that includes waves in a V zone or an A zone in a coastal community. But I think there would be ways to do that. And unless Brooke, Jamie, Vince, you think otherwise, the report sort of suggested everywhere, this 95% confidence limit be used.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was on mute there. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Got a question from somebody saying, flood insurance studies sometimes already overestimate hydrology. So could these recommendations further inflate the SFHA boundaries there?
I don't know if they overestimate the
Yeah,
hydrology.
I was going to say, I don't know if that's an accurate characterization. I was just reading the
I
question,
don't think-
everybody.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
I mean, I think the current methodologies are aimed at essentially pulling in the mean or the median flow. If maybe someone felt that a regression area in a rural area was overestimating flows, I guess you could say they're overestimating, but that would be more because the regression equation hasn't been updated or something. But yeah, I don't think they're currently overestimated, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah,
This is Alan Ruloff. I guess I was going to make a comment in that.
Yes.
In that it often, if the flood insurance study is calibrated against high water marks, you've got historic high water data to calibrate and validate your data. It makes that much better chance that it's a really accurate representation. If you not calibrate it against high water marks, then it's a little more uncertain. But that's a key feature. If you've got historic flooding that you can represent and match against your flood mapping, it raises the confidence that people in the community have that they're accurate, and the community officials.
Yeah, and I will just add that in many cases, the hydrology from the FIS is quite outdated. So, it was representing existing conditions at that time, but there's a good chance that a lot has changed in the watershed since that time, and very likely maybe underestimating flows.
And I can add that this will always be a challenge where we're missing gauges and don't have data to know what's going on in a watershed. There's not any way that we can really correct that without adding gauges and collecting information.
And even where there is gauges, there may be, hydrology may have been done 15 years ago, and there's another 15 years of record. That's going to change the computation, and it could be that it's overstated from 15 years ago based on the next 15 years of record. So that's possible, but the tendency and what we're seeing generally is that hydrology is underestimated, generally speaking.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks. That's actually been quite insightful for me personally about the FIS thing there. But so moving on, we've got several more questions, time for maybe a couple more. So we're not going to get to quite all of them, but I do want to ask at least a couple more. And this, we've gotten a version of this question a couple times already. So the question is, what about future conditions? And this can be kind of for the full panel. I know it's a bit vague, but are you able to just expound a little bit on what kind of conversations, maybe what type of information or sources or whatever may have gone into those conversations and recommendations and so forth regarding the future conditions?
And Doug, I don't know if you want to talk about the 2023 recommendations, and I can talk a little bit about how it comes into the 2024 topics.
Yeah, so I mean, really the thrust behind proposing that the floodplain management regulations be oriented around a future conditions flood hazard is because over time, what we see is people being surprised that the floodplain has changed and now they're in it. And so part of the concept in terms of use of the future conditions was to estimate where the floodplain might be in the future, so that as you're managing, you're doing floodplain management in your community, you're managing flood risk in your community, you have some sense of where things will be. And so when development occurs, folks are already designed and either out of the way or above the floodwaters, at least at the 1% annual chance, 95% confidence limit. The parts of the equation, which I would argue very simplified in the report, to add the surcharge value and then to add other estimates associated with potential future conditions, are intended to also provide a little bit of an easier way to estimate those future conditions. I think a lot needs to be worked out, particularly for the last component of that equation, the potential and expected changes due to future conditions. But at a minimum, I think communities could adopt their the floodway surcharge. In essence, that surcharge is a number that is expected to be seen as an increase to the floodplain at a minimum in the future. So, Brooke, I don't know if you want to add the other items from the current report.
Yeah, so for the topics we're looking at for 2024, when we're talking about transitioning to a risk-informed NFIP, and we're talking about providing comprehensive flood hazard and risk data, that's going to include future conditions. Right now, where the FFRD team is, I believe that they have incorporated sea level rise, and then they're making the framework robust enough to incorporate the inland and riverine future conditions from climate change as the science progresses and we get a little bit more agreement among all the models. But the framework is being set up to incorporate that, and also will incorporate land use changes. So future conditions is a very important part of this comprehensive flood risk flood hazard and risk data that we're looking at for the 2024 report.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Thank you, Brooke. I think we're getting close to the end here. I think we'll try to do at least one more question, or maybe just the one. But Melissa was asking, how will these changes impact communities in the community rating system program? So wondering if there's any impact there.
Good question. I don't know.
I think the answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
Sure.
We talked earlier about, the implementation side of this. And I think we even discussed a little bit about levies and what might happen as a result of if FEMA were to adopt this 95% confidence limit. I think a similar question would be posed to FEMA. If they adopted this 95% confidence limit in future conditions, what might that do to the point structure within CRS?
Has to be looked at.
Yeah, would need to be looked at. I don't have any good answer really.
Yeah, that's understandable for sure. But good to know nonetheless, I would say. Okay, so we'll kind of wrap up Q&A there. But really appreciate the panel weighing in on that. And we do have a few more really good questions I'd like to see if we can kind of get our heads together and just get a couple more of these answered in writing. But we'll see what we're able to do. But with that kind of concludes our time. I do want to do one final poll, and you'll see it up on the screen. This one is going to be conducted within the Zoom software here. We're just looking for a simple rating, kind of let us know what you think about today's event. And while you're thinking about that, just want to reiterate, kind of let everybody know that there's quite a bit of promised follow-up from today's event. We'll have a recording. We'll have a certificate of attendance for you. We'll be adding CECs to your file, should you have earned them. So all that's going to happen, it's going to take us at least a week. So kind of bear with us, be patient, and we will get those materials to you as soon as possible. So be on the lookout for those in your inbox, please. With that, thanks again, everybody, for taking time out of your afternoon to join us, and to our panel of presenters for sharing everything about TMAC with us today. Really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.